The latest edition of the World Bank Nigeria Development Update identifies the fact that Nigeria's growth prospects have improved compared to 6 months ago. But the macroeconomic framework has weakened. Now, titled The Continuing Urgency of Business Unusual, the report looks at the impact of inflation and other headwinds on the populace of Africa's largest economy and gives solutions on how to turn things around. Very much looking forward to this conversation. Joining us to discuss further from our Abuja studios, Shubham Chaudhuri, he's the World Bank Country Director for Nigeria, and Marco Hernandez, he's the World Bank Lead Economist for Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Good evening to you. Shubham, I want to start with you. Your report says that Nigeria is a bit of a paradox. Nigeria is in a bit of a paradox as far as our growth prospects are concerned. How can you talk us through that, please?
Hi, good evening, Rotas. Yes, so it's a paradox. It's very simple. Look, compared to 6 months ago, Nigeria's growth prospects seem to have improved. Our own projections for what 2022 growth will be are somewhat higher. Not as high as we would like, but we're certainly happy that it's higher than we had thought it might be. But the paradox comes because some of the things we had stressed 6 months ago in terms of the fiscal and inflationary pressures that Nigeria was likely to face in 2022 have in fact become more severe. And our concern is that even with the higher growth, the fact that these fiscal and inflationary pressures have become more severe is going to make things difficult and in some sense make both the government's task but also the economy puts it in a much more vulnerable place.
Thank you so much for that, Shubham. I really appreciate it. Marco, you co-authored this report, Marco Hernandez. How have Nigeria's growth prospects improved over the past 6 months? And is that why you revised your growth estimates upwards?
Thanks, Rod, and good evening to you and to everyone who's watching. So indeed, we have updated our growth projections. 6 months ago, we were thinking that the economy was not going to be recovering as fast as it did in 2021, and that also set the tone for 2022. The good news is that we have faster growth. We're projecting 3.4% in economic growth by the end of this year, and that was higher than what we were projecting 6 months ago, which was around 2.8%. Now, in terms of what is driving growth in the economy, we see a tale of two economies in Nigeria. On the one hand side, a positive tale, which is the tale of the non-oil economy. Think about agriculture, services, part of manufacturing as well, that has been driving growth upwards. And that growth has been faster than expected. But on the other hand, we have the tale of the oil sector. And here the situation is not as good because production has been coming down and that has been actually dragging growth. So one of the things that we do highlight in the report is that because we do have these differences, we have to pay attention about how those different dynamics would be continuing into 2023 and beyond, and more importantly, how much is that going to be sustained on the future and also the jobs that it will create.
Thank you so much for that, Marco. Shubham, let me come back to you. The World Bank, in fact, inflation forecast for Nigeria, you've revised them upwards. Inflation is highlighted and mentioned heavily in the report. Can you speak on the revision of the forecast and the challenges inflation poses for Nigeria? In fact, we just got our inflation figures, a new 11-month high at 17.71%. Can you speak towards that?
So I think in terms of just where the uptick in inflation has come from, obviously some of it is due to what's happened, the global consequences and the fallout from the war in Ukraine. Fuel prices, food prices have gone up, and that's going to translate into higher prices here in Nigeria for certain things. But what I think what really concerns us is that this is coming on top of over 3 years of double-digit growth in prices. And in particular, food prices. And why do we worry about food prices in particular? Because that's a basic need. That's what hits most Nigerian households. And our biggest concern right now is just arithmetically, when you have millions of people who are quite close to just able to meet their basic needs, put food on the table, as prices go up, and especially as prices of food go up, they're no longer able to meet those basic needs. And that's why we say that as a result of even before the Ukraine war, we were estimating that because of just the double-digit price increases, about 13, 14% a year, we expected, or we were estimating that about 6 million Nigerians who were near poor would be slipping into poverty in terms of not being able to meet their basic needs. As a result of the Ukraine war and the uptick in inflation we've seen since then, and then the latest numbers that you just cited confirm that, we're estimating an additional 1 million Nigerians are likely to find themselves unable to meet basic needs by the end of this year.
Thank you for that, Shubham. Marco, this question actually comes at a really good time because we just got breaking news that the U.S. Federal Reserve has raised its benchmark interest rate, the federal funds rate, by 75 basis points to 1.75%. So that's just breaking right now. What is imported inflation and what's the impact on an emerging market economy like Nigeria, taking into consideration this news is coming in that the U.S. Fed has raised interest rates again?
So it is indeed something that is being felt worldwide. I mean, globally, many countries are struggling to contain inflation, both in the developed world and in the developing world. So you will see many monetary authorities are trying to take action to contain that inflation. Now, in terms of Nigeria, Nigeria is a very large economy, but not necessarily one that is very well integrated into global markets, especially when it comes to basic necessities such as food. So the imported inflation that Nigeria has is actually relatively small in comparison to the domestic economy. Because if you take a look at what happened before COVID and how it has been, let's say, progressing during the past couple of years, then most of that increase in inflation, which was basically jumping from the 12.5% per year to now where we're seeing around 17%, 90% of that, so pretty much the totality of that increase in inflation, it is due to domestic inflation, not imported ones. So you're talking about, for example, the prices of yam, the prices of rice, the prices of maize, the price of cassava. Many of those that are basic necessities, especially for the bottom half of the income distribution, and those prices have been skyrocketing. So as a result of that, that is the main driver of inflation, and it highlights the urgency of taking action because, as Shubham was highlighting before, inflation was already pushing millions of Nigerians into poverty, and without lack of concerted action to reduce it, it will continue to push many more millions in the coming years.
Thank you for that, and your report does definitely highlight that. Thank you, Marco. Shubham, let me come back to you. Your forecasts for Nigeria's fiscal deficit and public debt to GDP are both revised upwards. How worrying is that for the nation?
I would say, so we certainly are worried simply because Nigeria has so many development financing needs, so many things that the government wants to invest in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investing in primary healthcare, basic education, and having a higher fiscal deficit or having to borrow to spend means that the government doesn't have the fiscal resources it needs. And in this particular case, what we've highlighted, we did this 6 months ago, is that some of this, that the government does have a choice. Nigeria has a choice in the sense that we had up over 5 trillion naira that potentially this year that's going to go towards covering the cost of PMS subsidies. And then we've said before, and I think many of your viewers will know, that PMS subsidies benefit mostly the rich, and some would say benefit mostly Nigeria's neighbors because the cheap gasoline is often taken across the border. That 5 trillion naira could have been used, can still be used for these basic investments that Nigeria needs in its people and its infrastructure. Unless that happens, unless those PMS subsidies are dealt with, the only alternative the government will have is to increase borrowing in order to meet basic recurrent expenditures, do the minimum that's necessary. And that's going to obviously add to the fiscal deficit, that's going to increase the debt. And in our view, what matters is whether you're borrowing, whether a country is borrowing for reasons that will, and then putting it to use in a way that's going to increase the productive capacity of the economy, of the people. Borrowing to finance PMS subsidies is a lot more concerning. And that's unfortunately where Nigeria finds itself now.
Yeah, the World Bank, you guys have touched on that several times. Thank you, Shubham. Marco, let me come back to you. There's a quote in the report that says the following: the worsening revenue collection at the federation level is increasing budgetary pressures for the states, and many states are in a precarious fiscal position. Don't want to drag you into politics here, but I mean, do you think things would be better fiscally for the states if they were more independent and didn't rely that much on the federal government, Marco?
So I think the bottom line is that that is correct. If the states will improve their ability to generate more revenues internally and depend less on the federation transfers, that will be a positive move for many that are facing a precarious situation, as the report highlights. Now, let's take a step back and let's think about why this is the case. So when we talk about lower revenues at the federation level, those are mainly the situation that is coming from the oil sector. So the petrol subsidy is eating a lot of the resources that the federation should be getting from oil sales, and as a result, the net oil revenues are 40% lower in 2022. This is our projection for the year, than what they were in nominal terms in 2021. Right? So that's a huge decrease, and only in a matter of 12 months. So if you see a 40% decrease in your net oil revenues, which, as you know, are distributed across the three tiers of government, then it's going to be much more difficult for those states, especially those states that depend heavily on those transfers from the federation, to be able to meet their budget expectations. Now, when you see across the states, our estimate suggests that on average, a state in Nigeria will lose about 10% of federation transfers for 2022 in comparison to 2021. That's when you put into account all of the elements that go into the federation transfers, which are beyond oil as well. So 10% in your nominal federation transfer is also a huge blow. And the other point about the precarity of the fiscal situation is that what we're seeing over the past 2 years is that some states are not only becoming more dependent on federation transfers, which means that a larger share of the revenues actually come from the federation. So that's, you have a range of states that are depending more on those federation transfers, but you also have states that are seeing higher levels of debt. Right, and this is something that we see particularly prominently in states like Ebonyi, Sokoto, and others that are seeing a move into both of those elements. Right, they're becoming more dependent on federation transfers, and they're also having higher levels of debt.
Thank you so much for that, Marco. Shubham, let me come back to you. There's another quote in the report. This is on the exchange rate, something you've both talked about extensively. The World Bank has talked about in Nigeria. The exchange rate policy in 2022 remains focused on maintaining an artificially stable official exchange rate through foreign exchange restrictions and administrative measures, thereby deterring inflows of capital, especially foreign direct investors. I guess, can you talk? It seems pretty obvious. Can you talk us through how that happens?
Okay, so let me begin by saying that, look, this is a phenomenally difficult, complicated, very delicate task of managing the exchange rate, of managing the limited supply of foreign exchange at a time when, the demand for foreign exchange is high. And so I don't want to underplay how difficult and complicated this is. The basic point we're making is that to try and think about the supply side. And we've often used this analogy before, that if there's increasing demand, it's like a pressure building up within a pressure cooker. And every pressure cookers have valves on top. What is the reason for that? It's to let the steam out. So, the pressure is released slowly. It's not, it's not all let out all at once, because that would be disruptive, but it's let out a little bit at a time. And that's in essence what seems to be happening in Nigeria in terms of the demand for foreign currency building up in a way without having really any valve to let out some of that pressure. And we see that translated into growing premium in the parallel market. A difference between the rate at which the official exchange rate or the rate that's available to investors and exporters and the rate that most ordinary Nigerians might face if they tried to get foreign currency through the parallel market. Now, what our suggestion is to just take into account that this is largely also a matter of confidence. How much foreign exchange people are willing to supply into the market also depends on how easily they perceive that they will be able to access foreign currency if they want to then convert back from Naira into dollars or some other currency. And having some sense of, okay, what is the arrangement? What is the system? Am I going to be able to get foreign currency when I need it? Whether this is domestic firms, whether it's foreign investors, having some sort of certainty and predictability about how this system works, and to know that, look, to some extent, the exchange rate is going to be responsive to some of these market signals, we think would help actually bring in supply into the foreign exchange market while keeping the disruptive changes from blowing out of proportion. But look, we'd be the first to say this is a delicate task, and I think our view right now is that having the exchange rate, the official exchange rate, the investors and exporters window exchange rate be a bit more responsive to market signals, to have a bit more price discovery. How much of a gap is there between demand and supply would help restore the confidence and certainty that would then bring in some of the supply.
Great stuff. Thank you, Shubham. Marco, the report has some policy suggestions. Starting with you, can you walk us through I guess how Nigeria can reduce her double-digit inflation as one of the suggestions there?
Yeah, so in this edition of the Nigeria Development Update, we highlight 3 pillars that we consider to be essential, and they're interlinked. The first one is the urgency to reduce inflation and to do so in a way that also protects the poor. On the other hand is the importance of addressing fiscal pressures, which we have been discussing already in this conversation. And one of the key ones here is the pressure that is coming from the much higher cost of the petrol subsidy than what we have seen in years. And the third area is about catalyzing private investment in order to boost job creation, and to do so in an environment where security risks have also increased. So once we put together these 3 pillars, let me just highlight some specific actions that we believe would help in each one of these elements. On the reducing inflation, I think that the most important will be to balance a sequenced set of policy actions that involved monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade, and also exchange rate management. So Shubham was just highlighting the importance that exchange rate management has on the predictability for investors to come in, but it also plays a critical role to reduce inflation, because right now most of that inflation is being captured by the parallel market rate. So by allowing more flexibility, we believe that that would also help to bring the parallel rate down, and with that, inflation. So that's one critical element, but there are also a series of, for example, trade restrictions like import bans that we have calculated in the report that there are huge factors driving inflation in Nigeria, and so is also the monetization of the fiscal deficits. So there are also other elements on the fiscal side and on the bringing investment side that will complement those efforts, like, for example, the removal of the petrol subsidy, but doing so in a way that we redirect spending into much more efficient uses of money, which will, for example, be education, health, roads, and so forth. Just to do a quick comparison, the over 5 trillion naira that Nigeria is expected to pay for the petrol subsidy in 2022 is much larger than the entire budget of education, health, and social protection put together, right? So that's a crucial statistics, and we all hope, of course, that there would be a consensus among the elites, so that such a politically sensitive reform would actually be taken for the benefit not just of what's happening this year, but also for generations to come, given that has a huge implications on the level of debt, for instance.
Thank you so much for that, Marco. Shubham, okay, you've already, extensively through this conversation talked about how we address the fiscal pressures. What about catalyzing, catalyzing private investments to boost job creation? How do we get that going?
So I think some of it is the basic macro fiscal environment and policies, certainty about policies. So there, foreign exchange management, we again come back to that. I've talked to many domestic firms, which would like to have great expansion plans, but they're not sure about their access to intermediate inputs because they can't get access to foreign exchange. Some of these intermediate inputs are imported. That's true in every country in the world, that no country is completely autarkic, where all firms, those that are adding, providing value added, increasing the value added of the economy, that everything is produced domestically. This is part of global supply chains, etc. That's where not having predictability of how much foreign exchange can be accessed at what point in time inhibits their plans to invest, to grow their businesses. In terms of another aspect of catalyzing jobs is same thing goes with trade restrictions. So some of the things that Marco talked about in terms of what might help reduce inflation, there's actually a win-win there. That those would also help, get firms domestically, get some of the inputs that they need. I think part of this comes down to just, a sense that, look, modern economies, Nigeria's economy is complicated enough that it's hard to predict how certain products, certain commodities, certain inputs make their way through the value chain domestically. So if we think that, we need to block this because we want to spur domestic production of commodity X, there are unintended consequences. And this is something we talk about in this report, that unintended consequences where, it turns out commodity X is actually quite vital for the production of commodity Y or some other good that actually has equal potential for adding value domestically. So a big part of the catalyzing private investment is getting some of the macro framework, the macro policies, right? And then, of course, there is the agenda of investing in infrastructure. Power is obviously the oxygen for any economy. And there again, there are fiscal resources that are needed, and there are also policy and regulatory clarity, shall we say, or reforms that are needed. And this goes down to the kind of level at which small businesses, micro businesses experience, find where they find difficulties doing business. So improving the enabling business environment. A lot of that agenda, I should point out, especially on the enabling business environment, rests with the states. Okay, so you've got the macro part, which is at the national level. There are things like power, et cetera, which require fiscal resources, but also the right environment for private investment to come in. And then there's a bunch of things that states can do, entirely up to the control of states. And with the executive governor's leadership, they could go far.
Thank you so much for that, Shubham. Marco, let me come back to you. The report says the following on poverty. Poverty reduction in Nigeria hinges on bolstering and sustaining growth and creating opportunities to share the proceeds of growth with poor Nigerians. Your estimates suggest that poverty may be becoming entrenched in certain households, particularly in rural areas in the north. And then Nigeria is spatially unequal, and the labor market is not creating the jobs needed to lift people out of poverty. In this current environment with geopolitical tensions driving up inflation and growth slowing, fears of stagflation, can Nigeria grow sufficiently to reduce poverty?
So we do believe in the potential of Nigeria, and I think that Nigeria can grow much faster than what it's currently growing. But the context is a difficult one, right? I mean, many economies around the world are struggling, especially to walk the fine balance between, things that could promote growth, but without deterring necessarily other particular issues such as inflation. And also, if a country has a very high level of inflation, reducing that inflation could also have a negative effect on growth on the short term, even if in the longer term it will be positive for growth. So just like we were highlighting before, I think it's a combination of things. On the one hand side is to make sure to get a basic macroeconomic framework right, so that investors are attracted to come to Nigeria, to put their money behind productive uses, and that they stay in the country so that many more investors could come. And that requires a series of actions that overall just change that sentiment, right? So we do highlight the short-term importance of what needs to be done now to catalyze investment, to reduce inflation, to address fiscal pressures. All of that is actually to make sure that that sentiment is stronger for investors to come. But that needs to be complemented with other policies that are not necessarily going to have an impact in the very short term, but that are essential for the longer term. We're talking about education and the building of basic service delivery for health, for example, the protection of the poor, infrastructure investments that will take also some time to build on the power sector, but also digital, to make sure that also we have an economy that is better prepared for what the future might bring, which might be very different to the type of jobs that we're seeing now. So it is that combination of things. But the most important issue of all is actually to have a consensus among the political elites, the business elites, civil society, or what are some of the basic structures that need to be reinforced or need to be changed so that Nigeria can escape this business as usual scenario, which right now is not delivering on the promises of many governments throughout, right? Because the per capita income growth has been very, very low, not only compared to other oil exporters around the world, but compared to all developing countries worldwide. So you have here an option, and it's Nigeria's option to take, to leave aside the business as usual and take into account a completely different approach that will spur a faster growth, and for that growth to be more inclusive. We're talking about action on the exchange rate, action on the petrol subsidy, and advancing reforms on the power sector side, making trade more open. And to do so, in an environment where, kids don't have to stay at home because of insecurity, but they can actually go to school and have better health services. So it's that combination that we believe put together will make Nigeria grow to much, much faster rates, right? And our objective is, of course, for those faster rates to be accompanied with sustained forms of job creation.
Marco Hernandez, lead economist for Nigeria for the World Bank. Shubham Chaudhuri, World Bank country director for Nigeria. Thank you both for a very robust conversation and another very robust report from the World Bank. We appreciate your time.